It's the winter of 1779 and 150 American soldiers are huddled inside a small wooden fort deep in the Ohio wilderness, completely cut off from the rest of the Continental Army, with British forces and their Native American allies surrounding them on all sides, and no relief in sight. The food ran out days ago, and some of the men have started boiling their moccasins because they've run out of anything to eat. And a man will do what he has to survive another day. That's what happened here in Bolivar, a place known as Fort Lawrence, the only Revolutionary fortress ever built in the Ohio wilderness. So in 1778, the Ohio frontier was a vast wilderness, just trees everywhere. As a matter of fact, there's lore, and it's probably true, that before Ohio was settled, a squirrel could get on a tree in Cincinnati and make its way all the way to Cleveland without ever touching the ground. A lot of trees. The American colonies had already claimed their independence from England and were, caught in a brutal war to determine the fate of the United States. Well, everybody thinks of the Revolutionary War as being battles that were fought primarily on the East Coast, Bunker Hill, Lexington and Concord, White Plains. And while that's true, that doesn't mean that there weren't other places that were pivotal in that Revolutionary War. And believe it or not, Ohio actually had a Revolutionary War fort. It was called Fort Lawrence, named after Henry Lawrence, who was the 5th president of the Continental Congress. And for about 8 months, that fort withstood the elements, the British, the Native Americans, and about 21 people died. And today, we are in Bolivar, Ohio, at the site of Fort Lawrence. To kind of tell the story of what went on here, what the colonial militia went through, and whatever became of this fort that stood on this site. So if you're curious, let's take a walk through history. Now, to really understand why Fort Lawrence exists and what it meant to the people who built it, we need to go back to the year 1778 and the Revolutionary War. Most people think the Revolutionary War was, something that was played out entirely on the East Coast. And while that's certainly where most of the action occurred, out here on the Ohio frontier, a different kind of war was being fought. And it was just as brutal and just as important to the war's outcome. So the British strategy in the West consisted of sending large numbers of troops into the Ohio wilderness. That's where they worked alongside their Native American allies. And their goal was to put constant pressure on the colonial militia and American settlements across the Ohio River. Frontier families were living in a state of constant fear of British and Native American raiding. These parties would raid without warning, burn settlements, kill or capture people, and there was little the Continental Army could do from a distance. Now, before all of that happened, there was a meeting between the American government and the Native Americans. Native Americans throughout Ohio were asked to come to this meeting to form a treaty, but only the Delaware showed up. And the Delaware signed on the line to be an ally, if you will, to the colonials. But in return, what they wanted was a fort built near their settlements to help to protect them from raiding native parties who weren't allied with the colonials. So when the colonial army set out from Fort Pitt, their goal was to reach the Delaware settlements and build a fortress. But by the time they made it here to the Tuscarawas River, they knew they weren't going to make it there. So they set up shop, as it were, here and decided to build a fortress in this location, which they did. So we're at Fort Lawrence now, and we're going to take a look at some of the walking path displays that they have and kind of discover what things looked like when the fortress still stood here. So let's take a look. So our first marker we come to talks about the fort itself and how it was laid out. It says Fort Lawrence, Ohio's only fort constructed during the American Revolutionary War, once stood here and serves as final resting place for soldiers who lost their lives during that conflict. The fort was constructed in 1778 as part of an ill-fated campaign led by American Lachlan McIntosh to neutralize the British Allies. So you can see here what the fort looked like. Now, down here is the Tuscarawas River. And you can see the main entrance and dock, if you will, faced the river, which the river is right over there. So right now, Interstate 77, the Ohio and Erie Canal, and then the river is right over in that direction. So we are standing, we're standing approximately here right now. And there's your entrance into the river. And here's the palisades that they built and some of the fortifications that they had inside. In the 1750s, before the Revolutionary War, English traders venturing west of the Allegheny Mountains discovered a vast forested wilderness they called the Ohio Country. And the British government assumed authority over the Ohio Country and tried to keep settlers out, even as colonists from Pennsylvania and Virginia flooded the area. By the spring of 1778, the Wilderness War for control of the Ohio Country resumed as tribal war parties supplied by the British at Detroit swept the colonial frontier. So that's what they built, and that's how it was laid out. The source of most of the trouble came from British-held Fort Detroit, which functioned as the command center for England's entire Western operation. The Continental Army's thinking was that if the colonials could take Detroit, they could fundamentally change the course of the war out west and also affect the war in the east. General George Washington personally assigned General Lachlan McIntosh to lead the assault on Detroit and secure the west for the Americans. So McIntosh assembled an army of about 1,200 men and set his sights on Detroit. And in October of 1778, McIntosh and his army set out from Fort Pitt, which is near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and right away things started going sideways. The terrain was rough, the supply line struggled, and by the time they reached the Ohio's Tuscarawas River in, mid-November, it was clear that they were not going to reach Detroit before winter closed in. So right here we can see kind of a relief of what the areas looked like: Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Indiana, and certainly Ohio. And you can see right here is Fort Lawrence in 1779. Janaden-Hutton and Coshocton, this is where the Delaware natives were mostly housed. But you can see Fort Pitt was here. They made their way this far on a Native American trail, and then the winter set in. So they weren't going to be able to make it to Detroit. So they decided, here's where we're going to build, and we're going to wait for spring, and then we're going to attack Detroit. But of course, that's not what happened. But it kind of gives you the relief, the outline of what Ohio looked like. It says here the conditions at Fort Lawrence exposed with bright clarity the challenges of the frontier. The march to the Muskingum River Valley was slow, dashing any hopes of General McIntosh might have had to carry the campaign further. So over there in the distance, you can see archaeologists working. They are digging to see if they can find the original fortifications where everything laid. Of course, they're finding all kinds of memorabilia, if you will. The goal is to completely dig the site and find out where the original walls of the fortress stood, and then resurrect that. They want to rebuild the fortress in this area right here. So this is the Fort Lawrence Museum. They don't open until 11. I'm not sure we're going to get a chance to go inside or not. But the dig is supposed to happen sometime. Well, it's supposed to happen now, and it's supposed to continue until hopefully they can start putting up walls in 2028. So McIntosh ordered his men to build the fort that they can hold through winter and use it as a launching point when spring arrived. So the construction started in November, I think it was November 18th, 1778. They raised the walls, they dug the earthworks, the ground was frozen, but by December the fort was complete. So once the fortress was erected, General McIntosh realized that he had too many men, and the supplies that they brought were not going to be able to uphold that many men. So he took 1,000 men and marched back to Fort Pitt and left around 180 militia here. And the winter did not go well for them. Every time they went out to collect firewood or hunt for food, they were at the mercy of the Native Americans in the area who were not fond of the colonists on the frontier. Eventually, word got back to the British that the colonials had built a fortress here. So the British sent their own troops down, mostly Native Americans, but certainly some British troops came along, and they were led by a man named Simon Girty. Now, Girty was an American who, as a boy, was captured by the Native Americans and raised as their own. Now, Girty and the natives had surrounded the fort. They stayed tucked back into the wilderness. So if you can imagine the fortress right here, and the wilderness behind is where the natives and Simon Girty and the British troops were. And it was sometime in March, I believe, Girty and the Native Americans and British troops made it down to Fort Lawrence and surrounded the fort and stayed tucked back in the woods out of sight. So the colonials had no idea that the British or the natives were even here. And then one day, as a colonial party went out to get some firewood, the British forces attacked. About 15 soldiers, militia from the Colonial Army, encountered this large force. 3 men were captured from the colonials. 2 of the men were killed, and 1 man who was kept alive had papers on him that basically told the story of what was inside the fort, how things were going, how poorly things were. At that point, Girty knew he had the colonials. So the British knew exactly what they were dealing with. British Captain Henry Byrd basically wasted no time putting together a response. And on February 22nd, 1779, he arrived at the timber line surrounding Fort Lawrence with a handful of his own soldiers and somewhere around 180 Native American warriors. It's a large contingent. The next morning, a routine work party left the fort to gather firewood, and they ambushed within sight of the fortress. 17 men were killed. 2 were taken prisoner, and the rest scrambled back inside. The siege of Fort Lawrence had begun. Now try to picture what that looked like and what life looked like inside those walls. It was grim in a way. It was hard to appreciate from where we're standing today. The men couldn't leave. And every time someone stepped out to gather firewood or fetch water, they were risking their life. General McIntosh sent 120 militiamen from Fort Pitt to try and help. But when they arrived, they found the fort completely surrounded. They turned around and marched back to Fort Pitt. Yeah, they just decided, no, we're just going to leave. So the men inside Fort Lawrence really did the only thing they could do. They waited and they starved. Captain Benjamin Biggs of the 13th Virginia wrote about the siege, describing it as a slow, grinding kind of desperation. And the men were put on a short allowance first, a quarter pound of flour per man per day, and then less than that, and well, basically nothing at all. Until for 3 or 4 days near the very end, they were surviving on half a biscuit, if that. And when they ran out, they boiled their moccasins and made what passed for a broth, because a man will do what he has to survive. These were American soldiers, patriots, men who had come out to the Ohio frontier because their country needed them. And they were boiling their shoes for soup. That's what was happening on this ground. 2 soldiers eventually managed to sneak out of the fort under the cover of night. And they were able to go hunting, and they brought back a deer. The men were so famished that some of them, just out of sheer desperation, didn't even wait for the meat to be cooked. They just ate it raw. Colonel John Gibson was the man in charge of the colonial militia at the fort, and this is how and where he earns his place in the history books. Gibson knew that if the British had any real sense of how desperate things had gotten inside the fort, it could all be over very quickly. So he did something I think is genuinely brilliant given the circumstances. He ordered his men to roll barrels made to look like they were full of supplies, roll those barrels out into the view of the surrounding forces. The message those barrels sent was unmistakable. We have plenty, is basically what they were saying, and we're not going anywhere. So you can stand out there in the wilderness in the Ohio winter as long as you like. The captain of the Brits, Henry Byrd, saw those barrels, looked at his own men who weren't faring so well, and withdrew. And on March 24th, 1779, the siege of Fort Lawrence ended. A few empty barrels had accomplished what muskets couldn't, and Colonel John Gibson had saved every man still alive inside the fort through nothing but sheer nerve and a good poker face. So finally, relief came to the fort. About 500 men from Fort Pitt came all the way out to the Tuscarawas River, and they brought horses with supplies, so much food. And the militia inside the fortress were so happy to see them that they basically gave a salute to them using their own muskets. Well, That really spooked the horses, so much so that they ran off with the supplies. What was supposed to be a gesture of thanks and goodwill turned into sheer terror, basically, because all the supplies that those men needed were now gone. There were probably some that were toppled over and left on the ground, but certainly not enough to feed the men of the fort. So it was decided, let's just pack up and go back to Fort Pitt, which they did. They left the fortress standing, though, because they needed it as a decoy. There were other battles going on, certainly in the Revolutionary War. Fort Niagara in New York was being sieged heavily. They thought if they left Fort Lawrence here that the British troops up in Fort Detroit would think it was still occupied. So British troops never made it from Fort Detroit to Fort Niagara to help out with that conquest. They were preoccupied by a fortress in Ohio. It was empty. Pretty good strategy. Here on the site today is something that I think is really cool. So this, I don't know if you can see it, in this place of honor rests an unknown soldier who gave his life in the struggle for American independence. This is known as the Tomb of the Unknown Patriot, and they've given it a really good place of honor here where the fortress once stood. 2028 is going to be the 250th anniversary of Fort Lawrence, and so that's why the dig is happening now, and they've got a long way to go, that's for sure. But hopefully they'll get it finished, and we'll have an appropriate fortress to take a look at and see if it can attract visitors to Bolivar and help rediscover what happened on this site 248 years ago. No, 252 years ago. Math is hard. Long time ago. Okay, well, that was just a quick little trip out to Fort Lawrence, coinciding with the 250th celebration of our nation's independence. And it's a cool place. Fortunately, we're not going to be able to go into the museum, but it's certainly worth noting that this place is going to hopefully be going under some major construction to deliver to you everything that the fort looked like and stood for. Hopefully by 2028 they'll have that all figured out for everybody. And I wanted to say thank you to all of you for taking time watching today. Leave a like and a comment if you would. And we'll see you next time as we explore more curious history. Take care.